She had sat in courtroom 14 of the New York Supreme Court building 437 times. She had counted. Kayla Weston knew every crack in the marble, every groan of the wooden benches, every way the winter light hit the high windows and made the dust look like gold. She knew the smell of old paper and nervous sweat. She knew the particular silence that falls just before a verdict. She thought she knew everything about this room. She was wrong. The morning of January the 9th started like every other. Kayla arrived at 7:45 with her coffee, her backup ribbon cartridge, and the low-grade exhaustion she had carried since her mother passed 3 months ago. She set her stenography machine on its stand, adjusted her chair, rolled her shoulders twice, and opened her notepad. The prosecutor, a thin man named Gerald Fitch, was already shuffling papers at his table. Defense counsel, a woman Kayla had seen before named Dana Reeves, sat perfectly still with her hands folded. The gallery was half full. Journalists. Curious faces. Kayla didn't look at any of them. She never did. The bailiff announced the case. United States versus Caruso Vitali. Kayla's fingers found the keys on instinct. And then the side door opened. And the world stopped. He walked in wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than Kayla's monthly rent, his broad shoulders cutting through the stale courtroom air like a ship through still water. His jaw was sharp, his expression carved from something colder than stone. A serpent tattoo curled up the left side of his neck, its head disappearing just below his ear. His knuckles, wrapped around the back of the defendant's chair as he sat, were tattooed too, dark ink, old and deliberate. He was dangerous. Every person in that room felt it. But Kayla felt something else entirely. Her pen slipped. It hit the floor with a small, sharp sound that no one else noticed. No one except him. Because in the half-second after the pen fell, Caruso Vitali looked up, not at the judge, not at his attorney, not at the cameras, he looked directly at her. And Kayla Weston stopped breathing. Because those eyes. Dark, still, carrying something ancient and guarded behind them. She had seen those eyes before. Not in a courtroom. Not in a newspaper. Not on a wanted poster or a television screen. She had seen those eyes on a rainy afternoon in the South Bronx, 22 years ago, when she was 9 years old and completely alone and something terrible was about to happen to her. She had seen those eyes on the face of a boy who stepped out of nowhere and stood between her and the worst moment of her life. A boy who disappeared before she could even learn his name. Her throat tightened. Her hands, trained by years of muscle memory, somehow kept moving on the keys. But her mind had left the room entirely. It was standing in the rain on Claremont Avenue in 1902, looking up at a boy with blood on his lip and fire in his eyes, who looked at her and said, quietly and absolutely, "Go home. Nobody's going to touch you. Not today. If you've ever been saved by someone and spent years wondering what happened to them, stay with me, because what happens next will take everything you think you know and turn it inside out." The man on trial for racketeering, extortion, and the murder of a federal informant was that boy. Caruso Vitali, the most feared name in New York organized crime, was the child who had once risked everything to protect a little girl he had never met. And Kayla was the only person in the room who knew it. But that was only the beginning. Because what she didn't know yet, what she couldn't possibly know, was that he remembered her too. 22 years is a long time. Long enough to finish school, earn a degree, build a career, bury a mother, and convince yourself that a single afternoon in the rain was just a thing that happened once, not the moment your entire life pivoted on. Kayla had tried hard to believe that. She had mostly succeeded. Mostly. The truth was she still checked the mirror sometimes and saw the 9-year-old girl she used to be, backpack soaked through, heart hammering, cornered against the chain-link fence on Claremont Avenue by 3 boys who were too old and too angry and too close. She had been walking home from her grandmother's apartment. She had taken the long route because she liked the way the puddles reflected the streetlights. That small, beautiful mistake had put her exactly in the wrong place at the wrong time. The boys weren't strangers. She knew their faces from the neighborhood. That made it worse. They wanted her backpack. Then they wanted more than that. She had been too frightened to scream. She remembered the particular coldness of that fear, the way it turned her legs to concrete and her voice to nothing. And then he appeared. He came around the corner of a bodega at a full run, like he had seen what was happening from a block away and hadn't slowed for a second. He was maybe 11, 12 at most. Not big. Not frightening to look at. But something about the way he moved, direct, utterly without hesitation, made the three older boys pause just long enough. He put himself between Kayla and them. Just like that. No calculation. No fear she could see. He looked at the boys and said something in Italian that she didn't understand then and still couldn't translate now, but the meaning was absolutely clear. The oldest boy stepped forward. The boy from the bodega took the hit. One punch, clean across the cheekbone, that snapped his head to the side. He didn't fall. He turned back, spat blood onto the wet asphalt, and said something else. Something quieter. Something that made all three of them leave. Kayla had stood there, shaking, rain running down the back of her neck. The boy wiped his lip with the back of his hand. His knuckles, she noticed even then, were already scarred. He looked at her, just looked, steady and calm, and said, "Go home. Nobody's going to touch you. Not today." Then he walked back around the corner of the bodega and was gone. She ran home. She told her mother she had slipped in a puddle and that's why her coat was dirty. She lay in her bed that night and thought about those eyes. Steady. Ancient. Carrying something that had no business being in a 12-year-old's face. She thought about them the next day. And the day after. She went back to that block 3 times trying to find him. She never did. She asked around. Nobody knew a boy matching his description who lived nearby. Eventually, life moved forward the way it always does, and she stopped looking. But she never forgot the eyes. And now, sitting in courtroom 14 with her fingers barely functioning on the keys, she knew with a certainty that went beyond logic, beyond reason, beyond the 18-year gap in his face and the tattoos and the tailored suit and the federal charges, she knew it was him. Same stillness. Same ancient weight in the dark irises. Same absolute quiet that somehow took up all the space in a room. Caruso Vitali. She typed his name into the record for the 3rd time that morning and her hands were trembling. She pressed her knee against the metal leg of her chair to stop it. She breathed through her nose, slow and deliberate, the way her therapist had taught her. But the question that was forming in her chest was not something breathing could fix. It had nothing to do with her job, her oath, or her carefully maintained professional distance. It was simpler and more devastating than any of that. What happened to that boy? What road leads from a 12-year-old bleeding on Claremont Avenue to a man sitting in a federal courtroom facing a life sentence? What did this city do to him? And the answer, when it finally came, broke something open in Kayla Weston that she had not even known was sealed. She told herself it meant nothing. She was good at telling herself things. She had told herself she was fine after her mother's funeral. She had told herself she didn't need anyone after her last relationship ended. She had told herself that the job was enough, that the rhythm of the keys and the orderly flow of language into record was a kind of peace, and she had almost believed it. So telling herself that Caruso Vitali was just another defendant was not the hardest lie she had ever maintained. It was, however, the least convincing. By the 3rd day of testimony, she knew his posture. The way he sat, still as carved wood, one hand resting flat on the table, never fidgeting, never leaning, never giving anyone the satisfaction of watching him react. She knew the way he looked at the prosecutor during cross-examination, not with hostility, not with contempt, but with the patient, unblinking attention of someone who has learned that the most dangerous thing you can do in a room is show what you're thinking. She knew that he drank his water in 2 sips, always at the start of each session. She knew that when his attorney, Dana Reeves, said something he disagreed with, his jaw shifted exactly 2 millimeters to the left and no further. She knew all of this because she watched him. Not obviously. Not in a way that anyone would notice. She was a court reporter. Watching was her architecture. But she also knew, if she was being honest with herself, that the quality of her watching had changed. She was not recording him. She was studying him. On the 4th day, something shifted. The prosecution entered new evidence, a series of financial records, dry and technical, that required a lengthy sidebar. While the judge and attorneys conferred, the courtroom settled into a low, restless murmur. Kayla looked down at her machine. And when she looked up, Caruso was watching her. Not glancing. Not scanning the room. Watching her. Direct, deliberate, unhurried. The way he had watched her across a rainy street 22 years ago when she was 9 years old and terrified. She didn't look away. She should have. Every professional instinct she possessed, every hour of training, every fiber of the neutral, invisible identity she had built for herself in this room told her to look away. She didn't. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then the sidebar ended, the room came back to order, and he looked forward again. As if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just reached across 2 decades and grabbed her by the chest. That evening, Kayla sat in her apartment in Washington Heights with her laptop open and her tea going cold and typed Caruso Vitali into every search engine she could find. What she found should have frightened her away. His name appeared in connection with the Vitali organization, a network 3 generations deep that had survived every attempt by law enforcement to dismantle it. His father had died in prison. His older brother had disappeared in 2017 under circumstances no one spoke about in print. There were photographs, Caruso in expensive restaurants, at charity events that served as covers for money, on the steps of buildings that officially belonged to shell corporations and unofficially belonged to him. In every photograph, he wore the same expression. Closed. Contained. Giving nothing. But there was one photograph, taken at a community dinner in the South Bronx in 2019, buried 12 pages deep in a local neighborhood blog, that made Kayla set her tea down very carefully. In it, Caruso stood behind a table serving food to a line of people. Children, mostly. His expression in this photograph was different from every other image she had found. Not soft exactly. But open. Like something had been allowed to surface for just a moment before it was put away again. She stared at that photograph for a long time. Then she closed the laptop and told herself, firmly and clearly, that it did not matter. He was a defendant. She was a court reporter. She had an oath and a career and a life that had nothing to do with Caruso Vitali. She would finish the trial. She would do her job. She would forget about Claremont Avenue. She had almost convinced herself by the time she fell asleep. What she hadn't considered was what would happen when he stopped letting her pretend he hadn't noticed her. The next morning, he did. She was alone in the corridor outside courtroom 14, 15 minutes before the morning session, when she heard his voice behind her. She had known, on some level that she couldn't justify rationally, that this was going to happen. She had felt it building for days, the way you feel a storm coming before a single cloud appears. Still, the sound of it, low, unhurried, carrying something careful in its cadence, made her go very still. Kayla. Not Ms. Weston. Not ma'am, the way attorneys addressed her. Not the careful nothing sound of someone respecting professional distance. Just her name, spoken like he had been holding it in his mouth for years and had finally decided to let it go. She turned around slowly. He was closer than she expected, which meant he had been watching her for longer than the distance should allow. His attorney was not with him. His security detail stood at the far end of the corridor, far enough away to be present but not close enough to hear. Caruso stood with his hands in the pockets of his suit jacket, and for just a moment, one fraction of a second, he looked less like the most powerful criminal in New York and more like a person. Just a person, carrying something heavy, trying to figure out how to put it down. She said, carefully, I don't think we should be talking. His expression didn't change. I know. He said it without any attempt to argue the point. I know we shouldn't. I just needed to know if it was really you. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere below them, the building hummed its usual noise. Kayla looked at him and felt the exact sensation she had been defending herself against for 6 days, the collapse of professional distance, the way the past came crashing through the wall she had built around it, the recognition that was not just visual but cellular and deep. She said, South Bronx. 1992. He closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When he opened them, something had changed in his face. Something had been allowed through that he usually kept behind the stone. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, that was me. Kayla's throat tightened. She had imagined this conversation 1,000 times over 22 years. She had rehearsed things she would say, thank you, I never forgot, I looked for you. All of it evaporated now in the plain light of the corridor. What came out instead was, why? He looked at her for a long moment. You were 9 years old and you were alone and they weren't going to stop. He said it simply. Like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Like there was no other possible answer. She had to look away. She looked at the marble floor, at the long rectangle of light from the window at the end of the hall, at anything other than his face. Then she looked back, because she had never been able to stop herself when it mattered. She said, "The charges. What they're saying you did." His jaw shifted that 2 millimeters she had learned to read. "I've done things," he said carefully. "Things I can't take back." But the informant, he stopped. His attorney appeared at the far end of the corridor, heels clicking on marble, expression tight with the controlled urgency of someone who has just discovered their client is having an unauthorized conversation with a court officer. Caruso didn't look at Dana Reeves. He kept his eyes on Kayla. He said, very quietly, "I didn't kill Marcus Webb." She felt it. The way you feel truth, not because it's comfortable, not because it's what you want to hear, but because it lands in your chest with a particular weight that lies don't carry. She heard it in his voice. She saw it in the stillness of his face, in the absolute absence of the calculation she had watched him apply to everything else in that courtroom. He wasn't performing. He was telling her something real. Dana Reeves arrived beside him, touched his arm firmly, and said, "Mr. Vitale, we need to go in." He turned and walked with his attorney toward the courtroom doors without looking back. But at the last moment, just before he stepped through, Kayla saw his hand. The tattooed knuckles, the same hands that had steadied themselves on a rain-soaked street in 1992 and taken a punch that was meant for a child he didn't know. His fingers curled once, slowly, at his side. Like a door closing. Like a question he wasn't sure he was allowed to ask. Kayla picked up her case, straightened her jacket, and walked into the courtroom. She sat down at her machine. She placed her fingers on the keys. She told herself she was a professional. She told herself it was not her business. She told herself she would do her job and nothing more. And then the session began, and the prosecutor stood up, and what he said in his opening statement that morning changed everything. Because the evidence he presented, the evidence that was supposed to seal Caruso Vitale's conviction, was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Structurally, fundamentally, deliberately wrong. And Kayla was the only person in that room who knew it. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with the trial record open on her laptop, 3 legal notepads covered in her handwriting, and the kind of clarity that only arrives after 2 a.m. when all the noise of the day has finally burned off and what you're left with is the thing you have been avoiding. The prosecution's timeline was impossible. She knew this not because she was a legal expert, not because she had investigative training, but because she had been in that courtroom every single day. She had recorded every word. She had the transcripts of the preliminary hearings going back 4 months. She had watched Gerald Fitch build his case with the careful confidence of a man who was sure no one was paying close enough attention. He had been wrong about that. The witnesses placed Caruso in a warehouse in Brooklyn at 11:15 on the night Marcus Webb died. 3 witnesses, all consistent, all credible on paper. But 2 weeks before that session, in a testimony that Fitch had buried under a procedural motion and a lunch recess and 40 pages of financial exhibits, a building manager named Elias Grant had placed Caruso at a charity dinner in Connecticut, the same dinner that appeared in that photograph Kayla had found, the one with the children, the one where his face was different. The dinner ran until midnight. Kayla had recorded every word of Elias Grant's testimony. It was on page 211 of the preliminary transcript. It contradicted the prosecution's timeline by at least 45 minutes, enough to make the warehouse testimony physically impossible. Fitch knew this. He had to know. He had buried it. She stared at page 211 for a very long time. Then she closed the laptop, because what she was thinking went beyond anything her job description covered and deep into territory she was not sure she was equipped to navigate. In the morning, the call came before she had finished her coffee. The number was blocked. The voice was male, flat, and entirely without warmth. "Ms. Weston. You have a very good career. You're respected. You're stable. It would be a shame for that to change because of something that's none of your concern." She stood in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. She said, "I don't know what you're talking about." A pause. Then, "You know exactly what I'm talking about. Stay in your lane." The line went dead. Her hand was steady when she put the phone down. She was surprised by that. She had expected shaking, the way she had shaken on Claremont Avenue, the concrete fear that turns the body against itself. But this was different. This was not the helplessness of a child cornered against a fence. This was something harder and more deliberate. This was a choice. She called her friend Naomi, a public defender who Kayla had known since law school, someone she trusted completely. She met her at a coffee shop on 125th Street at noon and told her everything. Not just the timeline. Not just the transcript. Everything. The courtroom. Caruso's eyes. Claremont Avenue. The photograph. The corridor. What he had said to her. What she had heard in his voice. Naomi listened to all of it without interrupting, which was how Kayla knew she was taking it seriously. When she finished, Naomi turned her coffee cup in both hands and said, "Kayla, you understand what you're describing. You understand what it would mean to bring this forward. I know. You could lose your certification. Your neutrality is the entire basis of your role. I know. And if someone is already threatening you, then whoever buried that testimony has reach." "I know," Kayla said again. She said it quietly and without flinching and without a single note of uncertainty, because she had made the decision somewhere between 2 a.m. and this table, somewhere between page 211 and the sound of a boy who was 12 years old taking a punch in the rain so that a girl he didn't know could go home safe. She looked at Naomi and said, "He stepped in front of something that wasn't his to carry because it was the right thing to do. And he was 12 years old and he bled for it and he never asked me for anything. The least I can do is tell the truth." Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay. Here's what we do." And the plan that took shape over the next 2 hours was careful and precise and carried more risk than anything Kayla Weston had ever walked into willingly. But she didn't hesitate. Not once. Because some debts are not about money. Some debts live in the chest, in the marrow, in the particular way a person's eyes look when they have given something they cannot get back. And Kayla had been carrying this one for 22 years. The morning of closing arguments, Kayla walked into the New York Supreme Court building the way she always did, 7:45, coffee, backup ribbon cartridge, low-grade exhaustion, but everything else was different. She had filed the motion through Naomi's firm the previous evening. A formal submission to the court citing specific discrepancies in the prosecution's evidentiary timeline with a direct reference to page 211 of the preliminary transcript. By 9 o'clock, Gerald Fitch's face had gone the color of old paper. By 9:30, the judge had called a recess. By 10, there were 2 investigators from the state attorney's office in the building, and the name Elias Grant was being said in hushed, urgent tones in the corridor outside courtroom 14. Kayla sat at her machine and kept her eyes forward and breathed. She did not look at Caruso. She could not afford to look at him right now. She needed to be exactly what she had always been in this room, invisible, neutral, the faithful recorder of language. The irony of that was not lost on her. At 11:15, Dana Reeves stood and made the motion. She was precise and devastating and clearly had been waiting for exactly this opening. The buried testimony. The impossible timeline. The 3 witnesses who had been coached, who were, it would emerge over the following weeks, connected to a rival organization that wanted Caruso Vitali removed and had found a prosecutor willing to help them do it. The judge looked at the prosecution's table for a very long time. Then he looked at the submission in his hand. Then he called another recess and this one lasted 2 hours. When the session resumed, the charges were suspended pending a full review. It was not an acquittal. Not yet. But it was a door that had been sealed shut, cracked open by a single page in a transcript that a court reporter had memorized because she never stopped paying attention. Kayla packed her machine that afternoon with the same methodical calm she brought to every closing. The courtroom emptied slowly around her. Journalists moved in clusters, speaking quickly into phones. Fitch left without looking at anyone. Dana Reeves stood with Caruso near the defense table, her hand on his arm, saying something in a low voice. Kayla did not hurry. She clicked her case closed, picked up her coffee, cold now, 3 hours cold, and walked toward the door. She was almost through it when she heard her name. Not the way he had said it in the corridor. Something different this time. Something that had lost the careful weight of the thing being held back for too long. She turned. He was standing at the defense table, Dana Reeves gone now, the room nearly empty. He looked at her across the courtroom, the same courtroom where she had first seen him, where her pen had fallen, where everything she thought she knew about her ordinary life had come apart at the seams, and his expression was the one from the photograph. Not closed. Not armored. Open, in the way that costs something, in the way you only allow when you've decided that protecting yourself matters less than telling the truth. He said, "You didn't have to do that." She said, "Yes, I did." He looked at her for a long moment. "You could lose your certification." "I know." He was quiet. A muscle in his jaw moved. Then he said, "I looked for you too." The room was very still. Kayla felt the 22 years compress into something small enough to hold. All of it, the rain, the fence, the boy who bled, the girl who ran home, the woman who typed other people's truths into record for nearly a decade, the man who became something that the world had a very specific name for, all of it suddenly occupying the same moment, the same light, the same courtroom. She said, "You were 12 years old." He said, "You were 9. She almost smiled. He almost smiled back. They stood there, the two of them, in the particular silence that exists after something enormous has finally been said out loud, both of them understanding that this was not an ending. It was the most complicated possible beginning. The certification board would open a review. Kayla would testify. She would answer every question with the same precision she brought to every other truth she had ever committed to record, and she would not flinch, and she would not lie, and she would not pretend she had done anything other than exactly what she believed was right. It would cost her months. It would cost her sleep. It might cost her more than that. She had made her peace with that somewhere between page 211 and a blocked number and a decision made at a kitchen table at 3 in the morning. Caruso walked toward her slowly. He stopped when he was close enough that she had to look up slightly to hold his gaze. He said, carefully, "I am not a good man, Kayla." She said, "I know what you are." He said, "And?" She looked at the serpent tattoo on his neck. At the scarred knuckles. At the dark, still eyes that had not changed in 22 years, that still carried the same ancient weight, that still looked at her the way they had on Claremont Avenue, direct, steady, certain of something that most people couldn't name. She said, "And I know what you did when you were 12 years old and nobody was watching and it cost you something and you did it anyway." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What happens now?" Kayla picked up her case. She looked at him once more, this man, this complicated, irreducible, impossible man who had been woven into the fabric of her life since before either of them understood what that meant, and she said the only honest thing left. "I don't know. But I think we figure it out." She walked out of courtroom 14. And for the first time in 22 years, she didn't look back, because she didn't need to. She already knew he was watching. If this story moved you, if you've ever believed that the right person finds you exactly when it matters, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. This has been the court reporter realized the Mafia boss was the boy who saved her childhood. Until next time.